World is awful at times, it really is. The only thing I dislike more than living here is myself. But that's okay, we all get the blues sometimes. It'd be weird not to, considering how strange everything is. Perhaps the real problem is that we've built a culture where we aggressively enforce the idea that confronting the sad truths of the world is unhealthy or weird, despite the fact that we all do it, that we have to. And that actually, at the bottom of it, underneath kind regards and birthday cards, everybody is a total mess. And you should be one too.
Everybody is a total mess and you should be one too.
A billion of us little parasites at the moment, and average life expectancy is around 26.
What do you mean, parasite? Be a little bit more like, you know, we're not parasite, we're just humans.
Chances are about 300,000 people are having the worst day of their entire lives today. And isn't it nice not to be one of them?
Oh.
But it will come our turn at some point, of course. And what does one do when one's life falls apart? How the hell would I know? Do I seem like a happy person to you? But we might...
You seem just nihilist.
Want to talk about
It's funny.
A composer you won't have heard of, who in 1876 wrote to his nephew saying, "Indeed, my life is of little worth to anyone. Were I to vanish from the face of the earth today, it would be no great loss to Russian music." That was actually, oh, you know, fucking Tchaikovsky, easily one of the greatest composers who ever lived. Swan Lake, the Nutcracker, you know the cunt.
What a
And he
nerd.
somehow doubted himself constantly. Or take this writer, a struggling unknown, considered himself hideously ugly and stupid, and disliked his work enough he wrote to a friend asking that, after his death, all of his stuff was to be burned. He died at 40 from tuberculosis, and his friend ignored his wishes and had his stuff published anyway. The man was, oh you know, Franz fucking Kafka, one of the greatest writers of last century. Or how about this unknown Mexican painter living in the shadow of her famous lover, convinced of her naivety, sure she was a failure. Maybe you've heard of her husband, Diego Rivera. You've definitely heard of her though, Frida fucking Kahlo. Today we would generally know Diego Rivera as her spouse, not the other way around. We love you, Frida. But those were all artists. It'd be a bit suspicious if they weren't all a little bit blah blah, no? Well, how about this American statesman in the 1800s who lost his mother at 9, then his sister at 19, then his 11-year-old son. Himself, he suffered numerous bouts of the sads, writing once,
Yeah, but right now you're showing all the people that thought like that, but at the end won. You know, there's a lot of people that think like that, and they're right. They're not going to be they're not going to be remembered at all for anything they did. A lot of people are like that.
"I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would be not one cheerful face on
Oh,
the
that's
earth."
so cool.
I didn't expect you to know him. That was
We need to find more ocean paintings. You know, we did the winter paintings. I need to go on a quest for ocean, like storm paintings.
just Abraham fucking Lincoln. Add to the pile Michelangelo, Florence Nightingale, Beethoven, all of them slipping into periods when they reported they went to a place for a while from which they simply could not find their way back to themselves. The thing is,
Yeah, but it puts life into like, oh, at the end you're going to win, buddy. No, you're not. Probably not.
we know about their struggles because their lives are well studied. We're not famous, but we get the blues too, of course.
Yeah.
Oddly, it turns out that our brains mostly process physical pain and emotional pain in the same regions, and find it rather hard to tell them apart.
The thing, okay, physical pain is way more like, there's something about emotional pain that makes it so vague. You know? When you're physical pain, you know what it is, you know where it's from. When it's emotional, you're like, wow, wow. It's like, kind of, you know, that's why we say you feel the blues, because it's a color. It doesn't make sense. It's a color. While physical pain, there's, you know.
SADS actually do.
But yeah, it's crazy how you say that emotional pain is as strong as physical pain, which makes a lot of like, as a society, why did we take so long to like enjoy, not enjoy, but like, there's something about emotional pain that it's not the same. You know, maybe the brain processes it the same way, but like culturally, and how we look at that pain is not the same.
Hurt. Have you hung out with people after their hearts have been broken? It's like they've been shot. Now, if so many of us go to a bad place in the course of our lives, and if civilization is so old, how come we still don't have an agreed sense of how to combat or even talk properly about the emotional ouchies? We know what to do about dicky tummies and broken legs. Why don't we know how to fix broken souls?
Yeah, true.
Well, probably because we rarely know how to describe any of this stuff, even to ourselves. English is terrible for talking about complex emotions, especially the sad ones. Other languages...
Yeah, because we're talking here in colors and music. That's how I see it. You know, it's like colors and music. You cannot really explain what is a color. You know? The same way you cannot really explain what is a melody. But I mean, you can like sing it and you can show what it's a color, but like in a void like that, you don't. Yeah, do that.
Languages are far more specific. For example, Yahaburni, the Arabic for hoping you die before someone you love so you don't have to live.
It's like emotions and soul is like a weird qualia. It's like trying to explain an invisible force, but you always feel. It's like trying to explain and make gravity. You know, it's like you cannot really explain gravity. You can put like formulas and you can show stuff, but like at the end of the day, it's like it's still like that same shit, right? Like, I don't know why we say, like, the soul is more, like, enigmatic in some way. I feel you cannot explain more what's gravity to someone. It's really weird to say, like, explain... No, it makes sense, but, like, you can explain an emotion the same way you can explain gravity, but, like, there's something, like, with gravity that's... I don't know.
Without them, or l'esprit de l'escalier.
L'esprit de l'escalier.
For literally the wit of the staircase. For when you think of the perfect comeback, you could have said to a joke or an insult, but...
Oh, that's called l'esprit de l'escalier. Oh, that's so cool. I didn't know. Okay, l'esprit de l'escalier. That's cool.
Or cavalieri scaldati, Italian for
Cavalieri
repeated cabbage, as in trying to restart a relationship that didn't go great last time. It won't this time either. Please stop it. But we're lacking for nice things in English too. Cafune, Portuguese for when you're running your fingers through the hair of someone you rather like, or koi no yokan, Japanese for when you first meet someone and you already suspect that the two of you might be destined to fall in love, and my personal favourite, I'm Samkeit, German for the feeling of solitude you get when you're alone in the woods, which isn't supposed to be sad at all, but surely that can also be the worst experience, because there are two modes of being out in the woods, no? There's the old having a map and a plan and a big backpack full of Amsterdam truffles, and then there's the other mode, when you're stuck in the woods, lost at twilight, out of allies, with nothing but a terrible sense.
What about like just going to walk, enjoy the trees?
And you're completely alone in the struggle.
Wow.
To Chinese literature now. Why? Because shut up. And as an introduction, we'll first meet Zhang Zongchang, a 19th century warlord poet who penned such distinguished work as "You tell me to do this, he tells me to do that. You are all bastards. Go fuck your mother." No, this was real.
King.
Or the
King
Sky
shit.
God is also named Zhang. Why does he make life hard for me? If it doesn't rain in 3 days, I'll demolish your temple. Then I'll have cannons bombard your mum.
I love.
Let's jump.
This is great. This is great literature. I like that. I'm gonna keep it in my knowledge book. Wait, how can I? Wait. I need to go in that rabbit hole of Chinese warlord poems. I know he's going to. Wait. Chinese warlords poems. All poems by Chinese warlords Zhang Zongzhang. Okay, there's also one guy. He's just that guy. Oh, that's not the same guy. I don't think that's the same guy. You tell me to do this? Okay, here we go. Poem of a bastard. I saw lightning in the sky. It's like God wants me to get lit. If God isn't lighting up, then why is there lightning? Praying for rain. Okay, that's the one he read. Someone asked me how many women I have. I really don't know either. Yesterday, our boy called me dad. I don't know who his mother is. What a pavilion. Place is fucking nice. If the gods can get there, I'll take a seat too, have a drink by the window, sing some songs to the ocean, play some cards. I think I'll get drunk. This is sick. This is sick.
2,500 years back to 4th century BC China.
Lao Tzu,
a scholar who eventually gets tired of the kingdom he's living in and decides to go off and be a hermit. So
he's going to tell his story. His story is so cool.
Anyway, but a guard recognizes him at the city gate as he's trying to leave and says, "I'll only..."
Wait, a guard or okay, it's a guard.
...through if you write down all of your wisdom. Lao Tzu agrees and knocks out the Tao Te Ching, the founding text of Daoism, a religion still million strong in China, Malaysia, and elsewhere today. Now, no one's actually sure if Lao Tzu even existed, it's unlikely, but the Tao Te Ching sure does. Dao literally means the way, or the path, if you like. That is, the unfolding of the universe, more or less. And one of the central questions of the Tao Te Ching is, Cosmically, we know sod all about why anything is here. Historically, we're often powerless. And in our personal lives, we're strangers even to ourselves sometimes. How the hell are we supposed to live like this?
I love Daoism because it's like that the flow. You need to like there's a spontaneity and like into that way of feeling. It's like free jazz. You know, it's cool.
The answer, partly, is
it's like going flow. Yeah.
Masters of everything. Wu Wei, or doing but without striving. Abandoning the fantasy of control and accepting that we're not in charge of any destinies, least of all our own. Why do birds migrate? Because they feel like it. Why did I spend all of last Monday drinking mojitos and lying on the floor pretending to be an iggly wiggly squid? Because I wanted to. The universe knows what it's doing, and we are universe anyway. The more we try to impose our will on everything around us, the more futile it all becomes. And so we get wonderful lines like, happiness is the absence of striving for happiness, or the world belongs to those who let go. Or do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear? The original Taoists are 2,000 years dead now, but they weren't aliens. They worried about exactly the same stuff we do: grief, political turmoil, and a frustration at having to exist down here. And their reply to all that was fairly novel. We don't live in utopia, we live in a mysterious zoo of bullshit largely beyond our control. The only choice we get is how to react to it all. Now, I waste your time with all this only because the Tao Te Ching is one of the first serious attempts in history to...
I actually want to read that book, okay? That's like one of these books, like it's on my list. I want to read this. You know, especially with, I don't know how much, the timeline between Art of War and like that book. Like when do those two like coincide? And how much can I make like, you know, links?
Being alive. And it's probably not a coincidence that much of Taoism really got going a few centuries after Lao Tzu, when China fell into the Warring States period, as in 7 very angry states beating the jolly dickens.
Oh, I think that's Art of War started in that era, I think.
Out of each other, constant warfare, and just at the point when everything became fractured, Chinese thinkers began hungering for a mindset
there we go.
The chaos by.
He's going to talk about it.
How that happens. Personally or historically, something goes awfully wrong, and we end up looking for new ways of seeing. But anyway, it's alright, because stuff calmed down and everything went swimmingly after that.
Of course.
For over in Europe at that time, Athens is getting pulverized by the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War with thousands dead, but in the aftermath of all that instability, out pops Stoicism, an attempt to simply accept a changing and unpredictable world. If you can't put the fire out, then you may as well toast marshmallows over it. But it's alright because stuff calmed down and everything went swimmingly after that.
I also have noise.
Then in 64 AD, with the Great Fire of Rome destroying just 70% of the city. Then 79 AD, with Vesuvius the volcano going off and barbecuing thousands of people. Then 165, with the Antonine Plague sweeping through the Roman Empire, killing just 10 million people. But it's alright because stuff calmed down, and we're just in time for what's sometimes called the worst year in recorded human history, 536. A mystery fog has just turned up, probably thanks to a volcano going off in Iceland. The fog will last for almost 2 years, turning the sun into more of a cloudy moon. It'll be the coldest decade in 2.5 millennia. Crops start to fail because, obviously, widespread famine gets going, setting the stage in a few years for the Justinian plague.
At least they had cool corals.
Of millions. Then 755.
Look at these paintings, how fucking cool is that?
Which will kill...
Whoa.
Or eventually tens of millions. Then
look behind, well, the castle and the spirits.
755 and the Anlushan
Whoa!
in China, a civil war that'll kill around 13 million people. Then the Mongol campaigns, wiping out maybe 40 million people. That's so
oh, there's a lot of war and death.
Million tons of carbon from the atmosphere, enough that we can still see it today in Antarctic ice cores. But it's alright because then 1349, Europe gets to enjoy the Black Death, wiping out millions. But out of that, however, comes humanism, where we begin playing with the idea of relying on human reason and compassion rather than exclusively upstairs heavenly stuff. Then the Spanish conquest of the Americas in the 15th century, millions will die to violence and disease. Then the 30 Years' War in Europe in the 1600s, maybe a mere 8 million dead, but it also partly inspires the Enlightenment, pushing personal autonomy and representative government. Then the Industrial Revolution, bringing in enormous innovation, but also urban poverty, out of which though we'll end up with, among other things, Romanticism and Utopianism. Then the Napoleonic Wars with millions dead, because of course. Then the First World War, kindly dispatched.
Wait, I'm sorry, I was thinking about the
Industrial Revolution, bringing in enormous innovation, but also urban poverty, out of which though we'll end up with, among other things, Romanticism and Utopia.
Utopianism. I want to see the kind of utopia they said at that time. Ain't that the Panopticism, like kind of there?
And the Napoleonic Wars with
Anyways.
millions dead because, of course,
Napoleon, let's go.
kindly dispatched about 50 million people. Then the second installment, killing 70 million this time, out of which though we'll get existentialism and Daoism and pacifism and a bunch of other fun flavors of delightfully modern madness. It'd be better not to have the tragedies in the first place, but it is pretty neat how resilient we can be, even as everything goes down the toilet in our own little lives and on the big global stage. And that we know just as well as our ancestors did, life is cruel and intolerably awful at times, but if one dares to stare directly into the unavoidable abyss of pain, loss and tragedy, the reward at the other end is often new eyes.
Wow, new pair of...
As well, I don't know, I fucking hope so. But it's alright, because here in the
Yeah,
present,
alcoholism.
it's finally calmed down, and everything is definitely going to go just swimmingly
Of
from
course.
now on.
Of course, it's the end.
I used to see my neighbour in the lift of my apartment block sometimes. He was about 40 and always disgustingly optimistic. I would tell him how I'd just broken my foot or had my bike
Yeah,
stolen,
maybe you have to
and he'd
learn
say
from him,
something
bro.
like, "Oh, but that's great. You must have learned so much about yourself." These responses always made
Goodbye,
me to go
bike.
out and purchase very pointy medieval.
You've been a good friend.
And so I started avoiding him. Then, a bit later, I was in the basements of the block storing some stuff and found an old public death notice. And the notice happened to be talking about my neighbour's wife. It turned out she had died a few years before. I stopped avoiding my neighbour after that. His relentless positivity was still sort of irritating, but in it now, I saw an incredibly quiet strength.
Fucking nerd! Can't even
Oh,
talk to
I
people
saw
normal.
someone is secretly broken.
I'm sorry.
Being a kid is this weird experience of everyone older introducing you to the world. Oh yeah, they say, there's the library, and there's the cinema, and the bakery, and that's
League of
the
Legends,
full
there's
of
League of
despair
Legends.
you'll end up in sometimes where all of your dreams are savagely crushed for no obvious reason. And you say, sorry, what? And they say, oh, and over there is the juice bar. But something happens or nothing happens, and one morning, a little older, you do wake up in the cave, seemingly alone. It's very dark in there, and you wander about for a while, but you can't find the exit. No problem, you think, I've got this compass. But the needle just keeps spinning. No problem, you think, I'll dig my way out.
Chaos! It's time to learn about yourself, Chaos!
But soon your hands are bloody.
Don't become psychotic!
So you abandon that. No problem, you think, I'll just wait for rescue. But all you hear are the distant voices of the rest of the world on the beach outside, apparently having a lovely time without you. And so you carve your name into the rock, because what else is there to do here but sit in misery and wait for nothing? But you do come out of the cave again, of course, often with the help of friends, or sometimes via events just as mysterious as those that brought you in here. But you come out of despair and fall back into the world, and hopefully everything is fine once more. Strangely,
Wow,
though,
so deep.
perhaps a while later, you pop back to the cave out of curiosity, but with a torch this time, and find that your name was not the only signature on the wall. There were hundreds of signatures of everyone you've ever known, millions from all the others who did their lonely time in here as well. Because it would be odd to go an entire life without occasionally losing the plot. It would be weird to live as a talking primate, knowing just enough to know that we know basically nothing, surrounded by disasters, losing people forever as we do, and not have a bit of a fucking wobble now and then. It isn't amazing so much chaos and suffering has happened across history. Rather, it's amazing that it happened and we're still here, still being decent sometimes. That in spite of all the horrors, we still came up with democracy and aspirin and winter fashion for cats. That we continue in the face of loss and despair. And because of that, because we continue, a while from now we get to stand on the high cliff looking out on the warm day with all of our wisdom as we experience yet another feeling we don't have a word for in English, énouement. The strange sense that having arrived now in the future,
That's not a thing I use,
tell the
énouement.
past self that everything will be okay, because it will be. Until the next time you take a little vacation in the cave of despair perhaps, and another version of you waits quietly ahead in the future, having braved those hard times as well.
The
so
giraffe!
you can return
Is
back
he
to
going to
yourself
invest in
and begin
Bitcoin now?
as we always,
Did he learn his lesson?
always do.
Did he learn his lesson? Is he going to invest? Wow, that's so deep. I used to love Exorbitant 1, but I feel it's really weird. I haven't really listened to him for a while. It's like now that I look through a new set of eyes, it's like I see it differently. You know? It's like it's such a great starting point to think about that shit. This channel is great for that. It's like a good ass starting point. You know, it's really like gold. This is gold. Oh well, humanity. I'm not going to watch that Semite shit. I saw some clips on Twitter and I was like, God, you should have politics. So yeah. Yeah. Okay, I want to see. I'm going to rewatch what Let's Talk Religion, Daoism. Okay, because that's where I learn a lot about all the religion. You know, it's a great ass channel. It's like a step above. And I want to see Daoism again. Because he's talking really in details of what Lao Jing wrote about.
In ancient China, somewhere around the year 500 BCE, the great scholar Lao Tzu was working as a keeper of records for the ruling Zhou dynasty. His name, Lao Tzu, literally translates to the old master, and the story implies that he was a scholar of some prominence, having an important position within the empire and being a very greatly learned man. But one day, possibly because of political instability and the increasing immorality of the rulers, Lao Tzu became disillusioned with his job and position and decided to give it all up. He left his position as
become an hermit, live in the wood,
his belongings, and started walking. His destination, away from China, into the mountains to live the rest of his life as a hermit.
These paintings are so beautiful.
But just as Lao Tzu reached the very borders of what was then China, he was stopped by a guard by the name of Jin Qi, who recognized the old.
It's like there's a sensitivity there about like how they do nature scenes, okay? That like European don't see the same way. You know, it took like more longer for them to like see it in a like more artistic way, you know? It's like when you think about Van Gogh and stuff like that. Beforehand, it was realism, kind of, I think.
By a guard by the name of Jin Qi, who recognized the old master. His reputation had preceded him, and the guard recognized him as a great scholar. After Lao Tzu had explained his intentions to leave China and live as a hermit, the guard would not let him pass unless he would disclose to him some of his great knowledge. Lao Tzu agreed and proceeded on the spot to write down in text
let the old man be an hermit
knowledge in about 5,000 Chinese characters, or 81 brief chapters. He then handed the text to the guard before stepping across the border into the unexplored frontier, never to be seen again. The text that he wrote down became known as the Tao Te Ching, and is also sometimes named after its author, Lao Tzu.
Oops, sorry.
And it became the most central and foundational text of Daoism, one of China's most important and significant religious and philosophical traditions. The story I just told you is, of course, very romantic and fascinating, but the problem with the story is that it most likely isn't true. We aren't even sure if the old master himself, Lao Tzu, is even a real historical person. But that doesn't change the fact that the text that he wrote down, the text that is attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, has become one of the most important and influential texts in world history, and especially for the traditions of Daoism and Chinese religion in general. Daoism is considered one of the main religious traditions of China alongside Confucianism and Buddhism, and to call it a religion in the Western sense can become somewhat problematic, as we will see, but we should not neglect its importance. The name Daoism is based on that central concept called Tao. It is mentioned and talked about in all the central Taoist texts and serves as a kind of unifying theme. It can sometimes be spelled Tao with a T, but this is the same word that is just written differently because translating Chinese characters can be very difficult because it's a completely different language, a completely different alphabet. But so what is the Tao? We can consult the very opening chapters of the Tao Te Ching to maybe get an answer. Quote, The Tao, way, that can be articulately described is not the unchanging Tao or way. The name that can be said out loud is not the unchanging name.
What?
Okay, so that wasn't very helpful, obviously, but it is an important starting point to understand this concept. The Tao, to these philosophers and writers, is something that cannot be described, it cannot be articulated, it cannot be understood in any conceptual sense. So
It's
really,
a
the whole purpose
thing.
of me trying to explain this to you goes against the very foundational idea of the thing I am trying to explain.
The thing you're trying to understand cannot be understanding. So it's like there's a name for it, but like limiting and putting that concept into like a box is not possible. Somehow.
But I'm gonna try anyway. The
Ooh.
word Tao literally means, as you may have seen from the translation, a way or path. It is a word that has a very long history in the Chinese and long precedes Lao Tzu and Daoism itself. It can mean
It's like a
literal
direction.
way or path, like one you walk on, but it can also mean path as in a certain school of thought or a tradition.
Can you say it's like a direction? The Tao is like a direction you take yourself upon. You know, it's certainly like orientation.
Like we would say, like a path to enlightenment or something like that. In ancient China, then, there were many different Taos. The school of Confucius, known as Confucianism, was one kind of Tao, and the school of Mo Tzu, which was another philosopher, it was another Tao. So Tao was used to denote a certain path or way to truth or the right way to structure society or the cosmos. To use more modern examples.
Oh, you can even use the Tao to like an higher level. It's not even like just a personal level. It's like an orientation. You can kind of like do I
Could
I don't
see
want-
communism as a kind of Tao, or fascism also as a kind of Tao. In
It's
general,
it's a direction. It's an orientation.
The world in general, that is also a Tao.
It's a pair of
But
glasses,
sometimes during
kind
the
of.
so-called Warring States period in the last few centuries BCE, there appeared some philosophers and writers who would turn the concept of the Tao on its head completely. The first among these is thought to be Lao Tzu, the old master, but as I said, it is quite likely that he never actually existed. Many scholars today instead believe that the Tao Te Ching may have been composed by many different authors, and the name Lao Tzu being used as a kind of pseudonym for this larger group of writers. This was quite common back in ancient times. But regardless of its actual authorship, the text is obviously very old and still served as the foundational text for what will become Daoism, as maybe the first text in that kind of school of thought. We have found copies of the text from around 300 BCE, so we know that at least it is from that early on in history. The second central text comes a century or two later and is known as the Zhuangzi.
So the Zhuangzi. Okay, so there's like two guys. The Lao Tzu. The Lao Tzu and then the Zhuangzi, and like both kind of wore Daoism and like in different period of time. But like, is there like a the Bible is like separated in two ways? Is like each chapter wrote by each guy is different.
Well, Zhuangzi, who lived
Zhuangzi and
in the 4th
Lao Tzu.
century BCE.
You know?
This text very much expands on the themes discussed in the Tao Te Ching, and let me tell you, this text is one of my absolute favorite pieces of literature in the world. It is just filled with incredibly engaging philosophical ideas and discussions, but at the same time also contains a great deal of humor and irony and bizarre imagery. It's just absolutely magnificent. These
that's
authors
cool.
in their text, as well as other similar thinkers at the time, present a new theory or idea of what the Tao is, one that is often kind of a commentary on other schools of thought at the time, especially in the Zhuangzi, who lived after both Confucius and Mo Tzu. He often talks about these other philosophers in his text, and then in his text he often critiques them, and so his idea of the Tao is often in response to, or in kind of like a play with these other philosophers. To Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, the Tao is no longer just a path or way to follow to truth. In a kind of ironic twist, the Tao becomes the very principle of existence and the universe.
It becomes your orientation.
So-called Taoist
Only that.
writers and philosophers had an ironic view of the Tao. To use the words of the scholar Brooks Siporin, In this context, Tao is precisely what is free of purpose and specific guidelines, the exact opposite of the traditional meaning of Tao.
So it's not even having an orientation. It's being free. Free jazz. I guess. Can we...
That Tao, which cannot be described or articulated, is often explained as the way of nature, that the universe and nature has a natural flow.
Be one with chaos or something. I don't know.
The Tao. Now, this isn't untrue, it's pretty accurate, but the Tao is also much more than that.
No.
The Tao, especially in the Zhuangzi, is like the very substance of existence and the world. It is a kind of oneness that hides beneath all apparent multiplicity. In an early section of the Zhuangzi, the author has a wonderful way of explaining this. The Tao is like the wind, he says, that travels through different holes of different shapes and sizes, and depending on the shape and size of the hole, this wind makes different kinds of noises. So the things in this world, including us, can be seen as these noises that the wind expresses. Each noise is like the individual things in the world. They are created by the emptiness of the holes, but ultimately they are all the wind. That is the Tao.
Okay, so here we're not even like in the orientation of someone. We're still like explaining how they see matter, you know, like the essence of a universe, kind of.
A wonderful way of explaining this. The Tao.
You know, it's like, okay, there's orientation someone can take, but here it's like it's more about like the nature, the essence of the Tao, right?
Oneness that hides beneath all apparent multiplicity. In an early section of the Zhuangzi, the author has a wonderful way of explaining this. The Tao is like the wind, he says, that travels through different holes of different shapes and sizes, and depending on the shape and size of the hole, this wind makes different kinds of noises. So the things in this world, including us, can be seen as these noises.
It's like everything you see is kind of a reaction of like that Taoist thing that's like always there. You know, it's like everything is a reaction to this. It's like in that flow, in the same way that the wind makes a sound out of the flute. It's like the same way can apply to things. Things is a reaction to that movement that's always there. And like you need to get to...
Wind expresses. Each noise is like the individual things in the world. They are created by the emptiness of the holes, but ultimately they are all the wind. That is the Tao that is whistling in different tones. Quote, a light breeze brings a small harmony, while a powerful gale makes...
It's like the harmony of stuff, you know, and that through that harmony, that's where the things that becomes stuff.
And once the sharp wind has passed, all the holes return to their silent emptiness. So in a way, the Tao is everything, and at the same time, it is nothing in particular. It's something that cannot be understood or grasped, but at the same time, it is the very essence of everything that we experience. It is a natural way in which it flows and unfolds, and this flow is very central to the Taoist text that I mentioned. With this foundation in mind, what then is the actual message of these Taoist texts? Since we can only summarize it very briefly, the goal of human life is to live according to or live in harmony with the Tao. Whereas other schools of thought
be able to get yourself as the sound it makes, you know, let the wind go through you and makes the sound out of your orientation in some way, you know?
Focus their Tao on following certain societal principles. For example, Confucius was very ritualistically focused on principles, whereas other schools of thought often focus their Tao on following certain societal principles. For example, Confucius was very...
And we don't forget about the orientation. Here, it's only one way you can orient yourself with that wind that's always there. You know, one way to get yourself with the wind. As some other thoughts, political thoughts like Confucius, orient themselves in another way to that wind-ish. You know?
Ritualistically focused, performing the right rituals, showing filial piety towards your parents. The Taoist authors went the completely opposite way. The way of the Tao is simple, it's spontaneous, and it's free. It critiques the ritualism of the Confucian thinkers, for example, their formal legalisms and practices. Instead, one should live in utter simplicity, flowing with the Tao and rejecting one's individual self. This flowing with the natural way of nature is often expressed through the concept of Wu Wei, often translated to inaction or action without intent. Now, inaction should not be seen as a kind of apathy or just sitting around doing nothing. Instead, it refers to a kind of acceptance of the events of life and the flow of the universe. Wu Wei means to not go against our nature, not to impose our individual will on events, but simply to let them happen, to let the Tao do its thing, as it were.
Let yourself drive through the wind and just enjoy the ride. You know, but the wind is outside of you, kind of, you know? It's just like
water,
I think
it should flow with the rhythm of the natural way and to be in harmony with it. Instead of resisting the wave and being destroyed, we should ride the wave. Quote, "The consummate person has no fixed identity. The spirit man has no particular merit. The sage has no one name." But inaction is at the same time the ultimate action. It is not passivity, but action without effort. There's a difference. So just like nature, the sage gets the most done through inaction. Quote, "The sage produces results and does not brag about it. He produces results but does not praise himself for it. He produces results but does not boast about it. He produces results because that's what he would do, and he gets things done without using any force." Lao Tzu also has a great...
It's like there's this humbling thing about it, right? It's like, at the end of the day, it's kind of the wind that does it. And that's your goal, is to use that wind for doing stuff. But it's a win. There's something you're not participating into it, right? It's like, it's the wind that drives you towards those things.
Section about water. Quote, "The greatest good..."
They use water, but like, I gotta like wind too. Maybe what? Anyways.
Is like water. Water's virtue is that it benefits all creatures, but contends with none. It resides in places most men hate, thus it takes after the way, or Tao. So this has clear ethical implications. The sage, the sort of...
And that's okay, that's why he's saying, and through that structure of your orientation, that's where you can like kind of see appearing the value, what it means to be good through that wind, you know?
Enlightened man is supposed to be light like a feather.
It gives an ideal, and through that ideal, there's like a certain, you know, what's good about that ideal and what's bad. Why that ideal over, like, you know?
Water and does not get in anyone's way. Quote, "He is good to those who are good, and good to those who are not good." Quote, "Therefore the wise man embraces the One, and becomes the model for all under heaven. He does not make himself seen, and therefore is as bright as the sun and moon. Does not consider himself good, and therefore is a pattern for all. Does not denigrate others to make himself look good, and therefore gets the credit. Does not make himself like the arrogant grip of a spear, and therefore becomes a staff of support."
It's almost like not doing anything going to make you the thing you kind of want. It's kind of funny.
Short, the concept of Wu Wei is of course very complex and complicated, but in simple terms it is a kind of living in harmony, flowing with the
There's a simplicity to it, right?
The nature
it's like
not imposing ourselves
almost ascetic
upon it, but instead simply living in harmony with the Tao. The Zhuangzi is a little bit rougher in its expressions of these kinds of ideas. To its author, Zhuangzi himself, the self, or ego, is to be conquered and destroyed as it ultimately isn't real. The only thing that actually is the Tao that expresses itself in different melodies.
Your identities, it will be like too like frictionist through the Tao. Yeah.
Like, to use the previous metaphor. But this also has profound implications for the ethical and philosophical ideas and discussions that he presents in this work, in often very humorous ways.
So seeing the stuff through that lens also makes you, again, we go back to that the value system. It makes you change the way you see good and bad.
He likes to tell stories that
But at the same time, like I don't like the saying that this is good, this is bad. I don't want to like misinterpret, you know, because like at the end of the day, the win. Yeah, I'm confused.
destroys any certainty around a certain subject. In an argument between, say, Confucius and Mozi, both have very strong opposing opinions about certain things, but according to Zhuangzi, no one can ever truly know who is right and who is wrong. Instead, when the difference between me and you, between this and that, is destroyed, there is no longer any talk of right and wrong. Instead, there is just the Tao playing its different melodies. Quote, this is also that. That is also this. That posits a this and a that, a right and a wrong of its own, but this also posits a this and a that, a right and a wrong of its own. So is there really any that versus this, any right versus wrong, or is there really no that?
It's kind of, yeah, it's explaining what I'm trying to say. It's like there's no, at the end of the day, there's just only the Tao. Having like something as being good or that, or bad or this, kind of makes no sense in here.
When
I
this
think.
and that,
I
right
think.
and wrong, are no
I don't
longer
know.
coupled as opposites, that is called the course as axis, the axis of all courses. Arguing that is called the course as axis, the axis of all courses. Arguing for a certain philosophical position is imposing our own self,
Oh.
will upon the way of nature, the way of the Tao, and thus it goes against the principle of wu wei or inaction. It creates a false sense of self that thinks it is right when in reality right and wrong is relative. The author often does this in the Zhuangzi. He points out how our
Okay, it's relative. Okay, I've got difficulties thinking about that one. That's fine. It's interesting.
quest for knowledge or truth is ultimately in vain because it is based on multiplicity and difference. But this isn't necessarily a kind of nihilism, even if some people have interpreted it as such. There are sections of the Zhuangzi when the author takes very clear ethical positions and still holds on to certain principles of kindness and
There's something about like the Tao making what's good, not you imposing your thing. But and at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense because the Tao doesn't really care. It just goes where it is, and there's like no judgment over anything. So that's why it's like water going into cracks. You know, it's like it's going to go there if it goes there. You know, at the end of the day, it's like it's just going there. It's not doing like good or bad. It's just going there, and like imposing yourself through that path, through a certain path, makes like it frictions. You know.
compassion. The point is to question the arrogance of some scholars of his time and people who are constantly arguing over the right Tao or the right truth. He is ironically responding by saying that the true Tao is that which neglects that any of your truths are absolutely true at all. There's plenty more fascinating parts and aspects of these books. If you're interested in the subject, I highly suggest you read these books, both the Tao Te Ching and...
Yeah, I want to read them one day. In my list, here we go.
Found in translations in different bookstores online. As I said, they are the very foundations of the Taoist tradition. There is also a third text called the Liezi, which is not as famous as the other two, but is still often considered a foundational text. These three are often considered like a holy triad of Taoist scriptures, the Zhuangzi, the Tao Te Ching, and the Liezi, even if the Liezi often becomes a kind of forgotten third wheel, even in this video, obviously.
Third
Of course,
wheel,
these early
L.
Taoist works also takes inspiration from earlier existing religious traditions in China. Many scholars believe that the authors, like Zhuangzi, comes from a shamanistic context, which was a common form of religion in the region at the time, and some of the early Taoist practices may have been connected to the shamanistic traditions, but we know very little of this as it isn't mentioned in any of the texts.
And so basically he's saying also that probably shaman religions inspired the Taoist philosophy to emerge.
Next. Another common theme is this. I'm sure you all recognize this symbol as the yin-yang symbol. It is also probably the most common symbol used to represent Taoism. Indeed, the school of yin and yang, which existed prior to the Taoist authors, greatly influenced them. The concept of yin and yang can in brief be summarized as the interconnectedness and complementary relationship between opposites in the universe. There can be no up without down, no dark without light, no hard without soft, and so on. In the Tao,
the essence of the universe is contradictory. And that's what it represents.
Jing, he writes, quote, there can be no existence
Right.
without non-existence, no difficult without easy, no long without short, no high without low, and without the sounds of musical instruments and human voices, where would their harmony and cacophony be? It is clear that what we call Daoism is very highly influenced by previous traditions that flourished in China previously and at this time, including the school of Yin and Yang and many others. And this becomes
Wait, the Yin and Yang is older than the Daoism. It came before. It inspired afterwards. Oh, that's cool.
Especially clear as Daoism later on would start to develop into something that we recognize more as a religion. You see, many people today tend to divide Daoism into two branches or types: philosophical Daoism, also known as Daojia, and religious Daoism, sometimes called Daojiao. Now, philosophical Daoism refers to the early Taoist texts and writers that we have discussed so far, like Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi.
More like, philosophical is more like academic, you know, it's more academic way to see the world.
And their kind of speculative form of Taoism. Religious Taoism, by contrast, refers to a more systematic and organized form of Taoism that developed later on and would come to dominate in history.
That and the religion part is probably more like about the practices. How can you use that into like something, you know, like it's like praying or whatever, right? It's more like traditional, like religion-ish.
This
I think, I don't know.
Still has the same text, the Zhuangzi, Tao Te Ching, and so on, as foundational, but it also includes complex rituals, various deities, a clergy, and alchemical practices, among many other things.
Alchemy.
This division, however, between philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism is somewhat problematic and anachronistic, however. It is often a construction by modern writers who wish to sort of extract the pure or original form of Taoism, the philosophical one, and separate it from what came later. Which
Okay, so making that distinction doesn't really work. They're too like interlinked. It's like, yeah, today's like, yeah.
Vicious and irrational, strange religious practice. But thankfully, many scholars today have started to question and reject this idea. Instead,
because like there's a thing I think with religion and old texts like that is like we're looking at them through rationality and science, which makes it, you know, the way you see those stuff differently. And I think scholars trying to separate both of them they're trying to make like, oh, that's more rational and that's more irrational. That's just a way to see like through our lens of science. But usually, basically, those two is not. It's just one thing. Religious and what, you know.
It's considered philosophical Taoism could simply be seen as the theoretical aspect of the practices of religious Taoism and vice versa. The early Taoist writers most likely practiced certain forms of shamanism, alchemy, or other practices that would today be seen as irrational or superstitious. So in my opinion, we should probably start to forget about this distinction between philosophical and
it's just one
Taoism.
thing. Separating them it's just like a modern thing we do. Make it more like science academic, you know?
Isn't to say that there isn't a difference between these early Taoist writers and the more institutionalized traditions that were developed later. Indeed, by the time of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi and Li Tzu, and all the way up to basically the 2nd century AD, and during the Han Dynasty, there was no organized form of Taoism. There was no group who called themselves Taoists. So for the first few centuries, what we call Taoism was simply a very loosely connected group of individual scholars or writers who shared similar cosmological and metaphysical ideas and who were likely...
Afterwards, it becomes something more solid. Something more like...
In the 2nd century CE, specifically in the year 142, the figure Zhang Daoling was
he's a tiger!
Lao Tzu, he claims, who at this point had been started to be associated with a deity, and who gave him the title Celestial Master. And Zhang Daoling subsequently founded the so-called Way of the Celestial Masters. This can be said to be the first organized form of Daoism, and thus to some the start of so-called religious Daoism. From this point on, this school and many others would develop into strong religious institutions that sometimes held political power in China, but always remained a strong component of society. To go through all these various different schools or traditions that we call Daoism in history is frankly beyond the scope of this video and also my own knowledge, to be honest, but I would love to cover it in a future video. But in very simple terms, from the 2nd century onwards, there would develop a multitude of different organized forms of Daoism, which could differ very drastically from each other. The only thing that they all had in common was a certain connection to these early texts, like Zhuangzi, the Tao Te Ching, and so on, as well as also other later texts that they all saw as authoritative. Some of these figures, like Lao Tzu, became viewed as deities or gods and were given significant roles in the cosmology and metaphysics of the religion. The practices and beliefs of these Taoist traditions are varied and complicated. The links between what is called Chinese folk religion.
So now it's really like how they use that philosophy to make a real practice, you know? A real way to do things, kind of.
Can be seriously blurry, and we should abandon any such clear distinction.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
offerings to various deities, spirits.
I still make distinction.
Alchemical practices and what we call Chinese medicine. These alchemical practices include both what we would call external alchemy, that is the physical manipulation of substances to create elixirs and such things, as well as kind of internal alchemy devoted to cultivating one's own inner life and purifying one's soul from evil inclinations, to use very Western concepts to explain it. It also includes elaborate rituals performed by a class of priests that include offerings and music, among many other things. Different meditation practices related to the cultivation of inner energy, known as qi, a theme that prevails in the early text as well. We find this in a lot of these traditions. Another famous component is different traditions associated with the search for immortality through different means, for example. There are many different aspects and fascinating things that I could dedicate future videos to. The deities or gods of Taoism are also very fascinating, for example, and there are also components where Taoism can appear very similar to other seemingly unconnected traditions. There's talk about the microcosm of the human being a reflection of the macrocosm, which
that's kind of cool.
Hermetic idea associated with the tradition of Hermeticism, and which also pops up in things
that
like
your inner self represents the outer self.
Religious traditions is of course very significant for the development and history of Taoism. Taoism, like any other religious traditions, of course, changes and evolves over time and place, and none of these meetings with other religions has been as significant as Taoism's meeting with various forms of Buddhism. Buddhism came to China very early on, as early as the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century.
Oh, now we're merging.
Or thereabouts.
Now
the earliest stage
time to make kids.
Organized Taoism or religious Taoism, it was in contact with thinkers, monks, and philosophers from the Buddhist tradition. The interactions between these two religions would prove both fruitful and sometimes also competitive. Especially in the early period, we find examples where there were great animosity between these two traditions. There were examples of Buddhists and Buddhist leaders who would oppress and persecute Taoists, something that goes against the preconceived notion that Buddhism is inherently peaceful or tolerant and open. But there's also the
tolerant Buddhism
with Taoist leaders,
the so-called tolerant Buddhist
persecuting and oppressing Buddhists. But even if there have been these kinds of periods of awkwardness between these religions, it has also been incredibly fruitful on both sides of the spectrum. The particularly Chinese forms of Buddhism that developed often strongly adopted elements of Taoism. This includes schools like the Tiantai school and especially Chan Buddhism, more famously known through its Japanese name, Zen.
Oh, Zen Buddhism got a lot of Taoism. inspired stuff. Oh, I didn't know that.
In Chan or
That's cool.
Zen, we find many influences from Taoist thought, to the point that some authors have claimed that the true spirit of the early Taoist writers like Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu is actually carried forward not by the Taoists themselves, but by the Zen Buddhists, rather than those pesky superstitious folk who called themselves Taoists.
Yeah. Yeah, imagine believing in gods and dragons, bro.
I hope this video has shown you that this kind of view should probably be viewed critically, but it's also a good point to show just how much, particularly Chinese and Japanese forms of Buddhism, owe to Taoism, and probably also the other way around. In general, religion in the Far East often functions in a very different way than what we would expect from a Western perspective on religion. The lines between different religions is often very unclear, as they often had a more fluid, you could say, approach to religious differences, even if, of course, there have been many periods of animosity and conflict, as I have just talked about. As we can see, then, Taoism has taken on many different forms throughout history, not only in its multitude of different organized forms, but also through influencing and basically becoming part of other religions altogether. In the modern world, there has been a resurgence of interest.
Okay,
in
now it's
Taoism in the
today.
West. This is often associated with the so-called New Age movement and other new religious movements that tend to favor Eastern religions or wisdoms.
But yeah, but the Western people are kind of like romanticized a lot of those
Practices
religion,
like Tai
right?
Chi and Feng Shui, often associated with Taoism, are commonly seen in a Western context. This is, of course, quite different from the forms of Taoism that tends to be practiced.
I want to know the link between those movements and like the martial arts. You know, like karate. I don't know where, because there's a cool stuff there too, right? But I wonder how much those style of fighting got some sources inside those movement, you know? I want to know that. I don't know where I can find this, but it's really interesting, you know? It does karate or whatever, I don't know, the martial art is more predominant in those countries, got like some philosophical strains to it when it once got formed.
Just in China itself today, which is often the case with kind of westernized forms of Eastern religions. In short, Taoism is a tradition that is very much still alive today. The wisdoms contained in the Tao Te Ching, the Zhuangzi, and the Liezi are appealing to readers today just as they were to those who lived 2,000 years ago. They
That's why it's so
inspire a vast
pretty.
amount of different religious and
Applies
philosophical
for-
traditions, both in native China, but also lately
It
in
still
the
tickles the
US.
brain.
Perhaps they simply appeal to a universal human condition that longs for a simpler life, one that is more in tune with the environment around us and the natural world, however you choose to define that. In Taoism, we are told to act without effort, to be just, humble, and patient, and perhaps above all, to just simply let go and be one with the way of the universe. And regardless
Be the
of your
wind.
opinion on these things, that is a very tempting proposition. I'll see you next time.
Thank you, man. God, I love this channel. It's so good.